Some people believe the Big 12 will die in expansion. I am not one of those people, and here's everything you need to know about the Big 12 in realignment and a crossover with Locked On College Football. This is Locked On Big 12.
You are Locked On Big 12, your daily podcast on the Big 12 Conference, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Drake Toll joining me here on today's show of Locked On Big 12. Let's just hop right into it, Drake. Let's say the ACC falls apart. Now, I talked on yesterday's show. I don't think that that's likely, even if Florida State were to leave, but lots of things that I don't think have been likely have come to pass before. We don't need to go into all of that and such, but if the ACC were to suddenly dissolve and you had all these teams sitting there, how prepared is the Big 12 to try and go scoop up teams like Pitt or Boston College or any of the other teams that would probably get left behind if big schools go to the Big 10 or the SEC?
Yeah, one of the first things to note here, Spencer, is we are trimming the fat of college football. That is some of the vernacular you're hearing out of the top names and the top talking heads. So a Boston College is not on the Big 12's radar. However, teams like Pitt, teams like Louisville are right there. And in the event the ACC implodes or only partially implodes, the Big 12 is going to go on the attack. Now, you've heard that NC State and Virginia Tech might be tied to North Carolina and Virginia. That's going to complicate things because I believe the SEC and the Big 10 see value in Virginia, see value in North Carolina because they create a chokehold on the East Coast, bring in big brands both educationally and athletically, and possibly bring in new TV markets. The only issue is little brother. They don't really like NC State. They don't really like Virginia Tech. And that puts the Big 12 in a position where if they could detach an NC State or Virginia Tech, they could land some middle-of-the-pack brands in the ACC and possibly survive off those. Now, you've also heard murmurs of a Clemson and a Miami. What are they going to do? They weren't very happy with the addition of Cal, Stanford, and SMU, and that's maybe the biggest catalyst to this. Florida State saying, look, we didn't make the college football playoff. We hate our grant of rights. We get a raw deal from a TV standpoint, and we hate these new guys. We want out. They are going to do whatever it takes, whether it's a settlement or actually winning in court, to go. Do I think that crushes the ACC? Not exactly. But if Clemson, who is already unhappy, or Miami want to go, then at that point, Brett Yormark is in a position to give them an offer, to try his very best. I do believe those are a couple of brands that are passed up to the SEC or the Big Ten if they want them. But Spencer, one thing I gotta hone in on here, a Clemson. 15 years ago, we weren't having this conversation about the Tigers. We didn't care where Clemson was. They were just a middling brand in college football that had been good in the 90s at one point. It's 15 years, 10 years of dominant winning that has created the brand that Clemson is. My case is, what if the next 5 years Clemson sucks? Dabo Swinney leaves and they're middle of the pack. Where does their brand fall? Florida State can be bad for the next decade and still have prowess. Clemson, on the other hand, maybe not. I think the SEC and the Big Ten realize that. If Kansas State wins 2 national championships and has a good 10-year run, they effectively become Clemson. So I don't know where a couple of these brands that are being so overvalued by the public will actually fall, and the Big 12 might have a better shot than we think.
I think when you talk about Clemson and saying, what if they suck with Dabo Swinney? What if it just completely implodes? Well, what does that mean? I mean, Clemson sucked last year. They went 9-4.
Yeah.
You know how many football programs in this country at the FCS, Group of 5 or Power 4 levels would look at 9-4 and give their coach an extension, say yippee-ki-yay, this was outstanding? I think that's a relative term of what's bad for Clemson. Like they would have to, I think, string together 3 or 4 consecutive years of failing to win 10 games before you could say, all right, they're not the same. They're not exactly that top tier brand. But right here, right now is when everything is happening. So I see your point about Clemson down the road. Well, maybe they don't look the same. But Florida State is trying to make this happen now. Florida State wants to get out of the ACC as soon as possible. Clemson's brand, I don't think, can take a significant enough hit in that short of amount of time to where they just wouldn't be appealing to pair with Florida State if you're the SEC or the Big Ten. I want to ask a logistical question about the Big 12 because when they added the former Pac-12 schools, the Four Corners, they were able to give them full media rights shares because of a clause in the Big 12's contract with ESPN and Fox. how many schools do you think that would apply to if ACC schools are suddenly available? Would they go for 2 more? Would they go for 4 more? Would they go for 6? How many do you think they would be able to give a sufficient amount of money to where it doesn't start diluting the pool for everybody else?
The magic number here is 20. I think the magic number for the Big 12 is going to be 20, which is adding 4 more schools. And it honestly depends on who those brands are. There's not going to be, hey, we'll bring in a full revenue share for Boston College or Syracuse. There's no way the Big 12, Brett Yormark, or the TV networks would buy into that. And the prime example is Washington State is a better brand, especially from a TV value standpoint, than Boston College and Syracuse. So if you're already passing up on Washington State and thus Oregon State, you're certainly not going to go after those 2 schools at a couple of the ACC. Look at Wake Forest. Everybody's sitting around thinking, oh man, Wake Forest isn't bad, but boy, they sure don't move the needle. They sure don't push the dollar here.
No.
So I don't want them. The Big 12 doesn't want them. Now, if Louisville's there, if Pitt is there, then we start opening a conversation of we can give 4 teams a full revenue share if they're the right 4 teams. But if it falls that, hey, the ACC is going to backfill with Tulane and Memphis and USF, and here's how they're going to keep everything together, I think that's when you start talking about the Big 12 going, yeah, well, we're not going to stick our neck out for Wake Forest. We'd rather stay at 16 than bring in Boston College.
I saw that article the other day as well that you just kind of alluded to about, the Tulane or South Florida and Memphis, maybe Oregon State, Washington State getting picked up in the ACC. If schools were to depart, I think the ACC would be in a rather precarious spot at that point, because if you're welcoming in those schools, how much revenue money are they going to need from their media rights deal, right? Because SMU is very unique. Cal and Stanford also kind of unique. Do those schools, is Memphis's athletic department able to take $0 in media rights the way SMU is? How much are you going to give them a share? How much do you bring them on for? How long before they can be a full member there? And then what's the state of your conference? And I want to get you out of here on this. If Florida State and Clemson, let's say they're the only schools to leave the ACC, and you're looking at a conference that is now headlined by Miami and North Carolina State and North Carolina, maybe Duke with Manny Diaz and what they can do in the transfer portal nowadays, bringing in guys like Malik Murphy from Texas. I think the playoff committee that is already looking at a 14 to 16 team playoff in 2026 would look at that conference and say, you get 1 automatic bid. Because I don't think that conference, even with Miami and NC State in there, I don't think that conference is on the same level as what the Big 12 would be. And obviously, it'd be way behind the Big 10 and the SEC. That's what I suspect they would do. Do you agree?
In essence, here, what you're creating is 3 tiers of college football, maybe even 4 if you want to talk about the group of conferences. You're looking at the SEC and the Big Ten. They're certainly the big dogs here. They still have dead weight. Northwestern still exists. Purdue still exists. And I know that any given year they can be good brands. They're just not. They don't fit the bill of a USC or an Oklahoma or an Alabama. Then at that second tier, there's the Big 12 sitting okay with a Utah to come in and anchor that conference. And then there's that weird level between the Big 12 where the ACC would fall without Florida State and Clemson, where that conference just isn't valuable from a media rights standpoint. And by the way, they don't have a guaranteed media rights deal through the end of their grant of rights. It was just kind of something that Jim Phillips and company hoped would come together, and it hasn't yet. So what you'd create is 3 tiers at the top of college football. And thus, at that point, that's why I believe the ACC likely does implode. It can't stand on a leg without Clemson and without Clemson and Florida State before at some point backfilling's not enough.
It can't stand on a strong leg. It could stand on a leg. It might be there because there are a lot of schools who would suddenly be left to join the Pac-12 rebuild or join the American Conference or what have you and such. But we'll cross that bridge in its entirety when we come to it. Drake Toll, Locked On Big 12, Monday through Friday on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts, just like this show. Drake, thanks so much for stopping by.
Spencer, always a pleasure. Hey, today's show is brought to you by a brand new sponsor at Locked On. It is Amazon Fire TV. I use a Fire TV because it makes it easy to view things. It's your number one destination for sports, from live games to highlights to in-depth analysis. Fire TV offers amazing experiences with viewing on smart TVs, as well as the TV Fire Stick that you can plug into your existing TV. It provides access to millions of movies, TV shows, as well as free and live TV. Whether it's the opening weekend of baseball or the college basketball tournament you're going to want to have a Fire TV. And right now, they created a Fire TV channel to deliver a constant supply of the latest videos from your favorite sports brands, all for free, including us at Locked On and most of the big pro leagues and college conferences as well. Fire TV channels lets you dive into all the games, analysis, highlights, and more to keep up to date with the latest in the world of sports, March Madness, NBA, and more. Fire TV with Amazon. Visit Amazon.com/Locked On Fire TV. So after all that conversation, what is the most likely expansion scenario for the Big 12? We've already told you about Andy Staples and how he thinks that the Big 12 is going to implode and that the conference won't exist because the two super conferences will be the SEC and the Big 10. And I don't think that's actually going to happen. I believe that Brett Yormark has too much prowess in this conference. Now, there's one thing. Here's my one caveat before I go into this. Brett Yormark is bringing DJ Diesel, that is Shaquille O'Neal, to the Big 12 tournament to play like a DJ set or something. He had Nelly at the halftime show of the football game, and he played that in New York on Times Square. And look, I think that's great. But look, I'll be honest with you. Brett Yormark could bring back dead Michael Jackson to do a concert, and it still might not get as many viewers as Auburn, Alabama, or Alabama, LSU, or Ohio State, Michigan. This conference can do as much as it wants with the pomp and circumstance, but that's not going to drive figures. What is going to is expansion. Money doesn't come from having Nelly or a washed up. Like Shaq's not even, if he was doing a dunk contest, that'd be dope. He's doing a DJ set, I think. It just feels a little out of touch. It's weird. It's not bringing in any more revenue. It's doing things different. I don't hate it necessarily, but it's not going to keep you on par with the SEC or the Big Ten. What's going to, though, is expanding with NC State. I think they're a good enough brand. Andy Staples would agree. He has them in the SEC and his realignment configuration. I think you bring in a Virginia Tech. I think you go out and you say, hey, look, what if we get a Pitt? What if we get a Louisville? Especially Louisville, who has done really well from an athletic revenue standpoint over the last few years, even when football isn't elite, though they were very good this past season, and even when basketball certainly isn't good. We'll get to where Scott Drew is going to fall when it comes to the Cardinals later. There is a realm in which, and I believe it's the correct one, if I had to predict today, you have to tell me what is going to happen with Big 12 expansion moving forward today. In 2 years, we'll see if you're correct. I would say that the Big 12 is able to collect Pitt. The Big 12 is able to collect Louisville, wants to collect those two teams. And I think it's still likely that Virginia Tech and NC State are in that fold. Now, what Staples failed to include here is there are talks of NC State and North Carolina having to go together. So if NC State went to the Big 12, does that mean North Carolina would go to the Big 12? Virginia Tech having to be together. If Virginia Tech goes to the Big 12, does that mean Virginia goes to the Big 12? And I don't exactly think that is going to be the case. I know that lawmakers they've just pulled their hand over all of this and said, oh, yeah, we can control it. But they can't. There is too much money for these universities, from TV deals to these conference grant of rights that they sign, that it's just not going to happen to where the state of North Carolina can say, you two have to go to the same conference and it's going to be the Big 12. I don't think North Carolina is going to be a Big 12 team. I hope they are. I don't think that Virginia is going to be a Big 12 team. I hope they are. And by the way, let's talk from a product standpoint. So the way that I view this is brands. Like, I'm looking at athletic revenue. I'm looking at how these teams are seen nationally. You know, the Jordan brand at North Carolina, Virginia brings in a whole new TV. You know, like you could try to get like a bit of a chokehold on the kind of the southeastern portion of the country if you're the Big 12. But let's talk just you and me from a viewership standpoint. I don't care about Utah playing Virginia Tech in a conference game. I don't care about North Carolina playing Iowa State in a conference game. Maybe you do, but this goes back to the conversation of, we're ruining college football. We are, right? The classic matchups that you love, the classic rivalries that you love. We're not going to see Oklahoma play Oklahoma State anymore. That stinks. Even those who wanted to see Oregon play Oregon State, like, it sucks if you're an Oregon State fan. And I don't think that's a good thing overall in the scope of the sport. But right now, when we're talking having a brand there, Virginia's good, but from a viewership standpoint, it's not. I think if the Big 12 in 2 years had North Carolina State, if the Big 12 had Virginia Tech, had Pitt, and had Louisville, I'm happy. We're in a good spot. And guess what? There's not a lot of fat we have to trim. I've got bad news for you. Northwestern is not driving in the Big Ten. Rutgers is not driving in the Big Ten. Purdue is not driving. There are brands in that conference that are weighing them down so much at the bottom of that conference that they don't really know what to do with them. The Big Ten is locked in with these schools through their own contracts, and it's a bad thing. Maryland is not in a great spot financially or bringing in the big bucks of the Big Ten. You go to the SEC, you see Vanderbilt, and you say, oh, wow, the athletic department sucks. Mississippi State is in essence a Big 12 team. Ole Miss is in essence a Big 12 team based on revenue. Missouri is kind of in that conversation as well. South Carolina is not too far off from it either. In this, the Big 12 top to bottom is pretty even. We don't have a Vanderbilt. And if you bring in NC State, Virginia Tech, you bring in a Pitt, you bring in a Louisville, you still don't have a Vanderbilt. You still don't have a Northwestern. That's what's going to keep this conference afloat, is because I don't believe that Greg Sankey can start cutting teams. I don't believe there will be relegation. I do not think that positive attrition will happen in college football. And thus, as long as the Big 12 as a whole is deep, you stay alive. And I do think 20 teams is the magic number. That's what's realistic for me. If I hey, what do you really think could actually, like, what's the genuine this could happen? Those are the 4 teams. Now, there is a wish list scenario. If you listen to this show every day or even frequently, you've probably heard me say it. Create a Clemson. That's my slogan here. If next week we learn that Kansas State was going to go win 3 national championships the next 10 years. They're going to be a perennial playoff team. They're going to have a decade like no other. That's Kansas State, who's never won a national championship. At that point, conferences would want to buy stock. You want Kansas State. Clemson, the last decade, has dominated college football. That's made them good. 15 years ago, you did not care about Clemson, the same way that most of the country right now probably doesn't care about Texas Tech. But if they started winning at the caliber that Clemson did, if they create their own Clemson, at that point, your brand is seen differently. That's why I believe in the dream scenario, Miami's on the table. There are so many issues at Miami right now. From being in Coral Gables, not Miami, the stadium being far away, like talking revenue and what they can bring to the table. And man, do they really reach the Miami brand? Miami, how much of a market value do you get there? And look, it's good. I'm not saying it's bad. That's not at all what I'm saying. I'm just, they are not playing with house money when it comes to the SEC and the Big Ten. Like, those 2 conferences aren't knocking down their door. And those 2 conferences aren't necessarily knocking down Clemson's door either, because think about it like this. If Clemson goes if Dabo Swinney leaves and Clemson goes 5 years of bad football, not even just objectively bad football, 3-9, 4-8, 5-7, which Nebraska is doing right now, by the way, it's wouldn't be crazy. Nebraska can do that. They're going to keep their brand. They're going to keep the revenue. They're going to keep the sellouts. Clemson can't. They're still not South Carolina, the flagship school of the state, who has sucked pretty much forever, kind of forever, and is still racking up money. If Clemson went through a slump like South Carolina's gone through, they wouldn't. That brand, like, think about, okay, same thing. Kansas State wins for the next 10 years. And they go 5 years of 4-8 every season. Their brand goes away. There are like 10 schools in the country that can lose consistently and keep their brand value. Clemson's not one of them. And right now, this is maybe the most important thing you'll hear in the show today. Right now, the SEC and the Big Ten, they are valuing brand prowess despite wins and losses. Clemson is built solely on wins, not on geography. Clemson's not built on being in a big TV market. They are built solely on wins. You can create that in Manhattan, Kansas. And the Big Ten and the SEC doesn't want that. So I believe in a dream scenario. There is a dream scenario where I'm not crazy, where Miami and Clemson do end up in the Big 12 because they're just not as pretty as they think they are when it comes to the SEC and when it comes to the Big Ten. Because anybody can create a Clemson. Anybody can create a Clemson. You win for a decade, you will skyrocket into the top 20 in national athletic revenue. Your budget will skyrocket. But the second you start losing, everything flips. Everything flips. Unless you're Nebraska. Unless you're Florida State. Unless you're Texas. We just saw it with Texas. So if you can give me that Kansas State, if you can give me that Texas Tech, that'd be awesome for this conference. And for Clemson, it's imperative you win now. But I just don't think wins and losses can get you a ticket to the SEC and the Big Ten. I just don't. And that's why I think there's a chance Clemson and Miami also fall to this conference. If you're Wake Forest, if you're Boston College, I'm sorry. If you're Syracuse, I'm sorry. We don't want you, and I don't think anybody else really does either. Sorry. But for Clemson, hey, you would fit in great here. Thanks, buddy. Coming up, Scott Drew's going to Louisville. Oh, what? This is Locked On Big 12, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's show is brought to you by LinkedIn Talent Solutions. There's one place that I go. I have a new intern. That is right. I hate saying intern, too. The guy's really good. He's not just an intern. He's helping run social media on Twitter. So you might see a tweet where you think, oh, that's a really good take. Probably him. Or a tweet that's, oh, that's a really bad take. Could also be him at linkedin.com/Locked On College. That's where I found the guy, and he's great. Right now, you have to check it out. A small business, an independent contractor, whoever you are, hiring is easy when you have quality candidates. So easy that 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. LinkedIn knows that small businesses are wearing so many hats. They help you do it all. Constantly finding ways to make the process easier. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnCollege. LinkedIn.com/LockedOnCollege to post your job for free. You keep in mind that terms and conditions do apply. So Scott Drew is headed to Louisville, or at least that is what Twitter wants you to think. The craziest part of this whole conversation is that while I say it's facetiously, Scott Drew is not going to Louisville, and I have plenty of things to back it up. If you're a Louisville fan, I have questions for you. If you're a Louisville fan and you clicked on this video, I want to know why you believe this and why talking heads from ESPN Louisville, which I thought those 4 letters meant something. I guess they don't really, are saying that, oh, well, effectively the message board comment that I saw that was, it's Scott Drew's to turn down. And he's not going to turn it down. Scott Drew's going to Louisville. Okay, that's a message board comment. I get that. That happens. But then when ESPN Louisville people are posting, according to my man, Drew Diener, Scott Drew is the clear number 1 choice for Josh Harrod and Louisville basketball. There's a clear number 2 that's practically primed and ready to go if Drew doesn't happen, but he doesn't list that guy's name, right? You can't. Oh, no, there's a clear number 2, but you got to guess. And the pie may not be in the sky. Don't rule out Billy Donovan. Wow. Here's what this is. This is as if the Clemson coach, Dabo Swinney, went to Nebraska. You're winning national championships at Clemson. There's not really a reason to leave. You're making good money, and if you asked for a raise, you would be given a raise, Scott Drew would. And Nebraska sucks. But I need you to know that Louisville sucks worse. History's great. I mean, look, history's cool. You can be like, oh, yeah, well, we were almost a blue blood back then. But that doesn't help the fact that they won 4 games last year. What? And that Louisville, over the course of the last, since Rick Pitino was fired, has been awful. 5 straight years without going to the NCAA tournament, but our history is good. Scott Drew just won a national championship, and by the way, since he came to Baylor, the Louisville job has been open 3 times, and he has not accepted it once. He's also turned down Indiana. He was effectively raised in Indiana. Any job, and Indiana, by the way, is a much better job than Louisville, but still isn't Baylor because those 2 programs have not been winning at a high clip recently. Scott is also, by the way, in the best conference in college basketball. Louisville is in a conference that might not exist in a couple of years, in a conference that might not exist tomorrow if we find out there's been a settlement between Florida State and the ACC and that they're going to leave. So why would Scott Drew then jump ship to go to a program that is in an inferior conference, to go to a program that is as bottom of the barrel as you can get from a win standpoint in power college basketball? We're talking Georgetown level, awful at basketball, and go to a place where he's not really familiar. He's not familiar. Why would you start over? Indiana would be oh, shoot, Baylor lost Scott Drew to the Blue Blood Indiana. This is one of the best programs all time, and Scott's from there. But now, the last few times it was different. Louisville didn't want Scott Drew then. We didn't even offer it to him. Or it's, back then, Scott Drew just didn't accept it. But this time is different. And it happens year in and year out. Scott's name is thrown around in this stuff. And I spent 5 years in Waco, spent a lot of time around Coach Drew. And at what point do we put it? How many decades does this guy have to coach at Baylor for you to give up? Bill Self doesn't have these rumors flying around. John Calipari doesn't really have these rumors flying around. And I know that Kentucky and Kansas are both way better basketball schools than Baylor. That is apples and oranges comparing the dynasty that is, like over the course of history in college basketball, Kentucky and Kansas both have had their dynasties. Louisville's been up there. They just aren't anymore. They just aren't. And for Baylor, having won a national championship under Coach Drew, he's got kids, young kids in Waco. There's no point in uprooting his family who really likes it in Waco. And if they didn't really like it in Waco, they probably wouldn't have been here for 20 years. And overall, like having been around him, I don't think there's a better representation of what Baylor is. I don't think there's a better character himself that represents Baylor in a better way than what Scott Drew does. And he loves the culture. He is a culture of joy. Jesus, others, yourself. Brother, you cannot go to Louisville. You cannot go to Louisville and your basketball team slogan be Jesus, others, yourself. There are like 3 schools in the country where you can do that. Baylor's one of them. So what if Louisville, their athletic department, got an interview with Scott Drew? What if they got an interview with Scott Drew, right? That's him stooping to the level of Louisville. And then he goes, I wanted to be Jesus, others, yourself. We're going to play unselfish. We're not going to put an emphasis on NIL. The portal will only go there when we have to. We're all about culture. They're like, let's back up to the Jesus thing. And this isn't even me taking a stand on religion in sports or religion in college sports. It's just me saying you can't, like it's a public school. And that's Scott Drew's built the perfect culture in Waco and won a national championship with it and been there 2 decades. We don't talk about Bill Self like this. We don't. Because the guy is coaching at Kansas. He has it made. Scott Drew just got a brand new arena, too. He's got it made. I think the kids thing is something we can't overlook as well. A lot of coaches stick around for the kids. A lot of the coaches that I've been around be like, I want to make my move in 3 years. Why? My kid graduates in 3 years. I want to make a move in 4 years. Why? My kid will be a 5th grade. If I get 5th grade, we can make that move smoother. Scott's not going anywhere. Stop. It's delusional. Give up. Go pick somebody else. Like, there's no way. There's no way. I will claw my left hamstring out with my bare hands and eat it raw, without screaming, no crying, on a live stream if Scott Drew goes to Louisville. And he won't. I think you know that. I think you do. It's just a little delusional. This has been It Always Will Be. See you on Monday. We're going to the Savannah Bananas and the Party Animals are going to the freaking Houston Astros Minute Maid Park. Yeah, we're playing a game there. It's sold out. 41,000 people watching on YouTube, on the Savannah Bananas YouTube channel. I'll be there, helping broadcast it. This has been It Always Will Be. Locked on. Thanks for making it your first listen every single day. Dose Grande.